Some 100 miles to the southwest of New Bern, the critical port city of Wilmington remained in Confederate control. When the Civil War began, it was the largest city in North Carolina. During the war, the port was a venue for blockade running. The blockade runners traded with European partners and helped supply the people and armies of the Confederacy. The geography of the Cape Fear River and limited resources of the Union Navy allowed for successful blockade running for most of the conflict. About 20 miles downriver from Wilmington stood Fort Fisher, the key defensive fortification protecting the critical port city.
The commander of the fort for most of the war was Colonel William Lamb of Norfolk. When he took over on July 4th, 1862, after inspecting the works, he said that a single broadside from a U.S. Navy frigate could destroy the fort. And so he determined to build a fort that could withstand the fury and the might of the United States Navy. And over the next 2.5 years, built a fort that was considered by most observers to be virtually impregnable.
The fortification was now the largest earthen fort in the Confederacy. It held 47 guns. Ulysses S. Grant, now in overall command of Union forces, was reluctant to commit the necessary troops to capture Fort Fisher and Wilmington.
He believed he needed more men around Petersburg, not fewer, but he understood President Lincoln's political dilemma. The fighting had grown so bloody and had reached that stalemate status that the media took to calling Grant a butcher. President Lincoln predicted in July of 1864 that he would be unable to retain his position as president, would not be returned to the White House, unless something occurred to turn the tide of the war in favor of the Union. So when the last seaport on the Gulf Coast, Mobile, Alabama, was closed by Admiral David Farragut's forces on August the 5th, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles rushed to the White House and implored President Lincoln to now support an attack on Wilmington. It was the last lifeline. It was Lee's lifeline. And if it could be cut, then the collapse of the Confederacy might well occur soon thereafter.
Lincoln agreed to the plan, but he deferred to Grant about the timing of the operation. It was not until December 1864 that federal forces made their attempt to capture Fort Fisher. The attack was carried out by ground forces commanded by Major General Benjamin Butler, supported by a 64-warship armada under Admiral David Porter.
Confederate intelligence was good. The Confederates at Wilmington knew the attack was coming. They were well prepared. The politics of command, however, haunted the Confederate hierarchy here. The commanding general of the District of the Cape Fear for more than 2 years was Major General W.H.C. Whiting, who was much beloved by his soldiers, somewhat difficult to deal with in terms of the high command. And when the Confederacy was finally convinced that a serious attack on Wilmington was forthcoming, President Jefferson Davis decided to remove Whiting from command. He and Whiting had sparred throughout the war, and to replace him with General Braxton Bragg, the most vilified, controversial general in the Confederate Army. In fact, when the Virginia media caught wind that Bragg was going to be sent to Wilmington, they said, "Goodbye, Wilmington." So Bragg comes to Wilmington in late October of 1864 to take over command from General Whiting, which was a terrible blow, not only to General Whiting, but to the men under his command who so respected and admired him. So with the attack imminent on Wilmington, General Lee detached one of his finest divisions, commanded by General Robert F. Hoke, containing more than 6,000 soldiers, to keep Wilmington in Confederate hands and open to blockade running. Unfortunately, Hoke's division did not arrive in time to participate in the first Fort Fisher battle. They had to make a sort of circuitous route by rail, and so they were still coming into the port around Christmas when the Union fleet appeared offshore.
The Union Navy began the attack by detonating a ship filled with gunpowder. an attempt to destroy the fortifications that failed.
Admiral Porter allowed his gunboat commanders to concentrate their initial fire on the most visible targets inside the fort, which were Confederate flags. From their position a mile to a mile and a quarter offshore, the sand mounds and traverses appeared, as one sailor said, like haycocks in the distance. But the flags floating above the fort were easily discernible, and so the gunboat commanders allowed their gunners to establish their effective range of fire on shore by targeting the flags. And Colonel Lamb inside the fort recognized what was happening, and so he moved all the flags to the backside of the fort, and sure enough, the fleet redirected a lot of its bombardment toward the new positions of the flags. Colonel Lamb later wrote that it was the biggest waste of gunpowder in the annals of warfare, as at least 1/3 of the 20,261 shot and shell thrown at the fort went over the fort and into the marsh or the river behind.
A temporary silencing of Confederate guns allowed the landing of Federal troops. But the Union assault on the fort was called off after Butler decided the defenses had not been sufficiently weakened. Federal forces would return in January, with the infantry now under the command of Alfred Terry. The fort, and then Wilmington, would fall in early 1865.